murder on the Corinthian queen, and secrets hidden at sea. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Tell me where you're watching from. Your comments make this journey special. Let's dive in. I've seen a lot of things in this line of work, but nothing quite like the scene that day at the brownstone. It wasn't that anything particularly odd happened. It was the lack of anything odd that caught my attention. Nero Wolfe was, as always, sitting in his chair, his massive bulk settling comfortably into the worn leather, while I stood by the door, waiting for the latest interruption to reveal itself. It wasn't a case I'd heard about, nor a person I recognized, when a slim man with an air of delicate anxiety knocked at the door. His name was Dorian Graves, and it wasn't just his name that struck a false note. It was his whole manner. He didn't exactly look like a man who would have a problem, but more like one who would hide it if he did. He was dressed for a business meeting, though his tie was too neatly knotted and his shoes too polished. His eyes darted around the brownstone as if expecting the place to explode with some hidden threat. "I've come to see Mr. Wolfe," he said, his voice high and strained. "I understand you are the person to help me." I motioned toward the drawing room, where Wolfe was ensconced in his usual position, his eyes barely visible over the edge of his book. I don't know why I bothered with pleasantries when Wolfe was obviously going to be anything but polite, but there's a certain charm in making people wait for the inevitable. Graves hesitated, then followed me in. Wolfe didn't move. He never did unless something moved him. He didn't even glance up as Graves approached. "Mr. Wolfe," Graves said, a little hesitant. "I need your help." Wolfe's reply came with his usual languid calm, punctuated by the faintest note of indifference. "So many people do. What makes you think you are among the few deserving of it?" Graves shifted on his feet, fidgeting like a man caught in an uncomfortable truth. He cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts. "I am the director of the Corinthian queen," he said, then added, "a luxury yacht." Wolfe's eyebrow lifted ever so slightly, but his voice remained neutral. "I know the ship. What of it?" I need someone to look into a matter that has occurred on board. It's delicate. It could ruin everything. Reputation, finances. It has to be handled quietly, or not at all." I was about to ask how much money Graves was willing to part with for this quiet handling, when Wolfe's voice interrupted me. "Not at all," he said, his tone sharp. "I do not handle matters that are not worth handling." "Speak plainly, Mr. Graves. What is your problem?" Graves looked relieved, though it seemed more like he was about to break down than anything else. "It's the crew," he said, leaning in. "I've had trouble with them before. Petty thefts, minor sabotage. But recently, something much worse has happened." "Worse than sabotage?" Wolfe asked, his tone dry as if the man's troubles were of no particular interest. Graves nodded, his hands trembling as he held the small leather case close to his chest. "There has been a murder. A member of the crew, the captain's first mate. It's not just the death that is a problem, it's what it suggests. There are whispers among the crew. Discontent, hostility. Someone is trying to destroy everything the Corinthian queen stands for." I had expected something more dramatic, but Wolfe didn't even blink. He looked at Graves with a cool, unflinching stare. "Your boat is far from a mystery to me, Mr. Graves," Wolfe said slowly. "But this is the first time I've heard of a murder on board. Who is the body?" "The first mate, Horace Keeley. He was found dead in his quarters, a knife in his back. No struggle, no robbery, just a cold, methodical act." I could see Wolfe's interest peaking, even though he still sat like a boulder in that chair of his. "Do you have any suspects?" he asked. Graves paused, then said, "I don't want to implicate anyone without cause, Mr. Wolfe, but there are tensions between the officers. A few of them seem eager for change. And then there's the matter of the captain himself, Captain Dunsmore. He's old, Mr. Wolfe. His mind isn't as sharp as it used to be. People say he's lost control of the ship, and that's the last thing you want aboard a luxury liner." Wolfe nodded once, sharply. He was interested now, and that was a rare thing. I knew what that meant. He wasn't letting this one go. "I shall consider the matter," Wolfe said, his voice even and controlled. "You shall hear from me in due course." Graves left, looking far less assured than when he arrived. He thought he was leaving with hope, but he was more likely leaving with a promise of eventual disappointment. Wolfe only moved after the door closed. "Archie," he said, "get me the details of this luxury yacht. I need to know the players, each one of them. We have to start there." I gave him a nod, already picturing the lies I'd have to dig through. But Wolfe was right. The ship's crew was at the center of the problem, and whatever it was, this was going to be more than a simple murder. There was something more, something far deeper in play, and I was going to find it. As soon as Graves was out the door, I headed straight for the phone. Wolfe's instructions had been clear, but his expectations were always high. He wanted every scrap of information on the Corinthian Queen, the crew, and most importantly, the first mate. If anything could be gleaned from the past or present, it would be through the details. I called the usual contacts: port authorities, maritime records, anyone who might have a passing knowledge of the ship or its crew. The Corinthian Queen wasn't some obscure vessel. It was a well-known luxury liner that catered to the wealthy elite. It had a reputation that went beyond its pristine decks and lavish cabins. But it wasn't a place for just anyone either. The type of people who sailed on it didn't just have money. They had a history, and often one full of secrets. It didn't take long before I learned more than I wanted to. The captain, Dunsmore, was indeed as old as Graves had suggested, approaching 70. A long-time seaman, his credentials were impeccable, but age had taken its toll. I got the impression that the captain had grown attached to his ship in a way that might have clouded his judgment. The first mate, Horace Keeley, had served under Dunsmore for almost a decade. From what I gathered, Keeley was ambitious, no doubt. If there was anyone who'd be looking to undermine the captain, it would have been him. The problem, of course, was that ambition rarely goes unnoticed. Someone had to have noticed Keeley's rise, his temper, and his secret dealings. That wasn't all I discovered. The Corinthian Queen wasn't just a yacht. It was a business empire, with ties to high-profile individuals who had no qualms about wielding power in subtle ways. Some of them had visited the ship recently, wealthy investors, a few shadowy businessmen, and there were whispers of deals that had gone sour. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had gone wrong, but there was no doubt that money and power had their claws deep in the ship's operations. The most unsettling part of the evening came when I spoke to a former crew member of the Queen, a man named Jasper who had worked as a deckhand until he'd been dismissed a year ago. He'd been rather eager to speak, which in my line of work always raises suspicions. "You want to know about the crew, huh?" he asked, his voice low. "There's a lot you don't know. People say the ship's haunted by the men who've worked there too long." "Haunted?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Not like you're thinking. I'm talking about people who go missing in the middle of the night, the ones who leave without a word and never come back. I've seen it myself. Keeley was one of them. He got away with things no one ever dared to question. But not everything stays buried." Mr. Goodwin Jasper's words hung in the air like a fog. I wasn't sure whether to believe him or not, but it wasn't the type of statement I could ignore. People like Jasper don't talk unless they've got something to hide or something to protect. I filed it away for later. The next morning, I briefed Wolfe on what I'd learned. As expected, he sat there without moving, his hands folded on his round belly, his face unreadable. He didn't seem surprised, which wasn't unusual. Wolfe rarely was. "Graves is a man of few words, Archie, but not without purpose. Wolfe said, slowly. The people who have come to him for help are always more than they appear. He knows how to choose his battles. What about the first mate? I asked. Keeley sounds like he might have been more trouble than Graves led on. Wolfe's eyes narrowed just slightly. Keeley was ambitious, yes. But ambition is not a sin in itself. It is the manner in which one pursues it that determines its consequences. The question, Archie, is what made him a target? Or who did the targeting? I could feel the gears turning in Wolfe's mind, and I knew I'd need to do more legwork. The more I dug, the more I realized there was something deeper going on here. A simple murder wasn't enough to unravel the web of secrets that surrounded the Corinthian queen. There were too many moving parts, too many people who stood to lose far more than just a man's life. The next day, I paid a visit to the shipyard. The Corinthian queen was docked, a gleaming vision of elegance. It wasn't difficult to get past the security. It's amazing what a little charm and a few well-placed words can do. What I found on board was just as I expected. A few disgruntled crew members, a ship that had seen better days, and an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. I made my way to the captain's quarters, but before I could even knock, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, I found Captain Dunsmore sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a set of papers before him. He didn't seem to hear me at first, but then he looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion. "Mr. Goodwin," he muttered, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" I was about to explain myself when I noticed the papers on his desk. Several of them were contracts, financial statements. There were more than a few numbers I couldn't quite make sense of, but one caught my eye. It was a document referencing a large payout, an investment from a shady group, one that involved the crew. This wasn't a simple case of sabotage. This was something more, a conspiracy of sorts, and the players were much closer to Dunsmore than he realized. But before I could press further, a figure stepped into the room. A woman, tall, with dark hair and a confident stride. Her gaze flicked over to me, then settled on Dunsmore. "I thought I told you not to speak with anyone, Captain," she said coolly. Dunsmore seemed to shrink in his chair at the sound of her voice, as if he had no defense against her presence. There was something familiar about her, something I couldn't quite place. She wasn't just part of the crew, she was something else entirely. Wolfe had been right about one thing. This was no simple murder. There were too many layers here, and far too many people who were playing a game they hadn't yet figured out. As soon as Graves was out the door, I headed straight for the phone. Wolfe's instructions had been clear, but his expectations were always high. He wanted every scrap of information on the Corinthian queen, the crew, and most importantly, the first mate. If anything could be gleaned from the past or present, it would be through the details. I called the usual contacts, port authorities, maritime records, anyone who might have a passing knowledge of the ship or its crew. The Corinthian queen wasn't some obscure vessel. It was a well-known luxury liner that catered to the wealthy elite. It had a reputation that went beyond its pristine decks and lavish cabins. But it wasn't a place for just anyone either. The type of people who sailed on it didn't just have money. They had a history, and often one full of secrets. It didn't take long before I learned more than I wanted to. The captain, Dunsmore, was indeed as old as Graves had suggested, approaching 70. A long-time seaman, his credentials were impeccable, but age had taken its toll. I got the impression that the captain had grown attached to his ship in a way that might have clouded his judgment. The first mate, Horace Keeley, had served under Dunsmore for almost a decade. From what I gathered, Keeley was ambitious, no doubt. If there was anyone who'd be looking to undermine the captain, it would have been him. The problem, of course, was that ambition rarely goes unnoticed. Someone had to have noticed Keeley's rise, his temper, and his secret dealings. That wasn't all I discovered. The Corinthian queen wasn't just a yacht. It was a business empire, with ties to high-profile individuals who had no qualms about wielding power in subtle ways. Some of them had visited the ship recently. Wealthy investors, a few shadowy businessmen, and there were whispers of deals that had gone sour. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had gone wrong, but there was no doubt that money and power had their claws deep in the ship's operations. The most unsettling part of the evening came when I spoke to a former crew member of the Queen, a man named Jasper who had worked as a deckhand until he'd been dismissed a year ago. He'd been rather eager to speak, which in my line of work always raises suspicions. "You want to know about the crew, huh?" he asked, his voice low. "There's a lot you don't know. People say the ship's haunted by the men who've worked there too long." "Haunted?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Not like you're thinking. I'm talking about people who go missing in the middle of the night, the ones who leave without a word and never come back. I've seen it myself. Keeley was one of them. He got away with things no one ever dared to question. But not everything stays buried." Mr. Goodwin Jasper's words hung in the air like a fog. I wasn't sure whether to believe him or not, but it wasn't the type of statement I could ignore. People like Jasper don't talk unless they've got something to hide or something to protect. I filed it away. For later. The next morning, I briefed Wolfe on what I'd learned. As expected, he sat there without moving, his hands folded on his round belly, his face unreadable. He didn't seem surprised, which wasn't unusual. Wolfe rarely was. "Graves is a man of few words, Archie, but not without purpose," Wolfe said slowly. "The people who have come to him for help are always more than they appear. He knows how to choose his battles." "What about the first mate?" I asked. "Keeley sounds like he might have been more trouble than Graves led on." Wolfe's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Keeley was ambitious, yes. But ambition is not a sin in itself. It is the manner in which one pursues it that determines its consequences. The question, Archie, is what made him a target, or who did the targeting?" I could feel the gears turning in Wolfe's mind, and I knew I'd need to do more legwork. The more I dug, the more I realized there was something deeper going on here. A simple murder wasn't enough to unravel the web of secrets that surrounded the Corinthian Queen. There were too many moving parts, too many people who stood to lose far more than just a man's life. The next day, I paid a visit to the shipyard. The Corinthian Queen was docked, a gleaming vision of elegance. It wasn't difficult to get past the security. It's amazing what a little charm and a few well-placed words can do. What I found on board was just as I expected. A few disgruntled crew members, a ship that had seen better days, and an atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. I made my way to the captain's quarters, but before I could even knock, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, I found Captain Dunsmore sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a set of papers before him. He didn't seem to hear me at first, but then he looked up, his eyes clouded with confusion. "Mr. Goodwin," he muttered, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" I was about to explain myself when I noticed the papers on his desk. Several of them were contracts, financial statements. There were more than a few numbers I couldn't quite make sense of, but one caught my eye. It was a document referencing a large payout, an investment from a shady group, one that involved the crew. This wasn't a simple case of sabotage. This was something more, a conspiracy of sorts, and the players were much closer to Dunsmore than he realized. But before I could press further, a figure stepped into the room. A woman, tall with dark hair and a confident stride. Her gaze flicked over to me, then settled on Dunsmore. "I thought I told you not to speak with anyone, Captain," she said coolly. Dunsmore seemed to shrink in his chair at the sound of her voice, as if he had no defense against her presence. There was something familiar about her, something I couldn't quite place. She wasn't just part of the crew. She was something else entirely. Wolfe had been right about one thing. This was no simple murder. There were too many layers here, and far too many people who were playing a game they hadn't yet figured out. The woman in the captain's quarters wasn't just a member of the crew. There was something in the way she carried herself, confident, self-assured, that made her stand out from the rest. She wasn't just here to handle logistics or supervise deckhands. She had power, and it was clear from the way she addressed Dunsmore that she wielded it with precision. "Who are you?" I asked, stepping forward with a smoothness I didn't feel. "I don't think I've seen you on board before." Her eyes studied me with the same cool detachment she had shown Dunsmore, sizing me up in a way that suggested she'd dealt with questions like mine many times before. "I'm Marissa Klein," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm the first officer on the Corinthian Queen." I raised an eyebrow. "First officer?" I repeated, considering the implications. "You're above the captain in rank?" Her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "I'm second in command. The captain has his hands full with other matters. It wasn't hard to see what those other matters might be." He had the look of a man who had lost control of his ship. I didn't trust the way she spoke, nor the way Dunsmore seemed to shrink under her gaze. It wasn't just respect. There was fear there too. "I've been hearing some things about the crew," I said, keeping my tone casual. "There's talk about a lot of tension, a few incidents that don't quite add up. Care to explain?" Her gaze hardened for a moment before she shrugged. "Tension is a part of any crew. It's a stressful environment. People crack under pressure, but that doesn't mean anything untoward is happening." She glanced at Dunsmore, her expression softening for just a moment. "We've had some rough patches, but nothing that couldn't be handled." I wasn't buying it, not for a second. "And the first mate? Keeley, was he one of those rough patches?" She stiffened, a muscle twitching along her jawline. "Keeley's death is a tragedy," she said with practiced calm. "But I'm sure it's nothing more than a tragic accident." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I watched her closely, my mind turning over every word, every gesture. She was hiding something. The way she reacted to Keeley's name, the tension that rippled beneath her calm exterior, spoke volumes. "And yet," I said, letting the silence stretch, "you seem unusually interested in this tragic accident, Miss Klein. A little too interested for someone who claims to be above reproach." Her smile returned, but this time it was colder. "I'm simply doing my duty, Mr. Goodwin. The death of one of my crew members is my responsibility, and I intend to make sure we find out what happened." There was more to her than that, though. There always is. The fact that she seemed so invested in keeping the conversation on safe ground told me that there were darker waters beneath the surface. I needed to get closer, see what the crew thought of her, and whether she was as above suspicion as she claimed to be. Before I could press her further, the door to the captain's quarters opened, and a third figure entered. He was young, mid-20s maybe, and his uniform was crisp, though there was a nervousness about him that clung to the edges of his movements. His eyes flicked from me to Klein, then to Dunsmore. "We need to speak with you, sir," he said to the captain, his voice barely audible. "The crew, there's been another incident." A disturbance. Dunsmore's face drained of what little color it had left, and he stood up with a slow, unsteady motion. "What now?" he muttered. Marissa Klein, to her credit, didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded as though this was just another task to tick off her list. "I'll handle it," she said. "The situation's under control." But I could tell she wasn't entirely certain of that. The uncertainty flickered across her face before she wiped it away. She turned to the young crew member and spoke quietly to him, instructing him to take the captain to the bridge. I stayed behind for a moment, watching them leave, the door closing softly behind them. Something wasn't right. Another disturbance, another incident that had to be handled. It felt too much like damage control, and from the way Klein had reacted, it was clear that she didn't want anyone poking around the darker corners of her ship. I didn't waste time. I had enough of a lead to know that the crew was on edge. More than that, they were fractured, divided. Whoever had killed Keely hadn't just murdered him. They had begun a chain of events that could very well tear apart everything the Corinthian Queen stood for. The crew wasn't just hiding something, they were protecting something. I left the captain's quarters and made my way back to the dock. I needed to speak to someone who knew the crew better than I did. My first thought was to find Jasper, but when I approached the area where he had been working earlier, I found the place empty. No one seemed to know where he had gone, and no one seemed particularly concerned about it. It wasn't until I spotted a familiar face, a short, wiry man named Harry, who'd been a deckhand for the Queen for almost 5 years, that I felt a flicker of hope. He was leaning against the railing, looking out over the water, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You got a minute?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He glanced at me, eyes narrowing. "I got a minute, Goodwin, but I'm not talking without a drink first." I didn't have time for pleasantries, but I knew I wouldn't get much out of him without some oil in the gears. "Let's take a walk," I said, nodding toward the nearest bar. "We'll talk over something stronger than water." He hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine. But you'll get no more than I'm willing to give." That was all I needed to hear. We walked off toward the bar, and as we went, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were layers to this case, each one darker than the last. We made our way to the nearest bar, tucked away near the docks where the salty air mixed with the dim, humid atmosphere of the place. The smell of old wood, stale beer, and cheap liquor clung to everything. The clientele was a rough bunch, men who looked like they'd seen their fair share of rough seas and had come back with more than just salt water in their veins. But Harry didn't seem out of place. He slid into a booth in the back, the seat creaking under his slight frame. He waited for me to join him, and I did, keeping my distance just enough to watch him closely. The bartender, a squat man with a graying mustache, gave us a nod, already pouring something dark into 2 chipped glasses without a word. I slid a bill across the table, and Harry grabbed it without hesitation. "This is good enough," he muttered as he took a long sip from his glass. The burn didn't seem to bother him, not like it did for most. I didn't waste time on small talk. "So, Harry," I said, leaning in, "I hear things on board are rough. Keely's death isn't the first problem, is it?" He grimaced, the lines on his face deepening. "Keely wasn't the first, no. But he's the one that matters. You know why? Because he was the last one with the guts to speak up about the ship's real problems." "Real problems," I repeated, tilting my head. "What kind of problems?" He glanced around the room, lowering his voice. "I don't know who you're working for, Goodwin, but you're going to want to be careful with this one. Some people on board, they don't take kindly to people asking questions. They'll bury you if they have to." I held his gaze, not backing down. "Who are we talking about here? Klein? Dunsmore?" Harry snorted. "Dunsmore's as useless as a bucket full of holes. Can't hold the crew together, let alone run a ship. And Klein..." He paused, eyeing me carefully. "Klein's not just a first officer. She's got her hands in things. Things I can't touch, can't even look at without risking my neck." I leaned in, my interest piqued. "What kind of things?" He hesitated. I could see him weighing the risks in his mind, trying to decide whether to push the conversation further. Finally, he looked me in the eye and whispered, "The crew's been shaking down investors. There's money going missing. Big money, Goodwin. People like you don't even know where to start with this one. It's all buried under layers of bullshit. Shaking down investors," I repeated, the pieces falling into place. It was starting to make sense. The tension on board wasn't just about a simple murder. It was about money, influence, and the power to keep things under wraps. "You're saying someone's stealing from the people who've invested in the Queen?" He nodded grimly. more than just stealing. It's a racket. They're running schemes. Ponzi stuff, even. Dunsmore's too old and too drunk to notice, and Klein, well, she's making sure it all stays quiet, keeps the cash flowing where it needs to go. I felt the weight of his words settle in. This wasn't just about Keely's death anymore. There was a far more intricate game at play, one that involved not only the crew but powerful figures who had a lot to lose if their secrets were exposed. "Where does Keely fit into all of this?" I asked. Harry's eyes darted nervously to the door as if someone might walk in and catch us talking. "Keely found out," he said quietly. "He got too close to the truth, and he wasn't smart enough to keep his mouth shut. They had to get rid of him before he talked to the wrong people." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Who did it, Harry? Who killed him?" He shook his head, his hand trembling as he set his glass down. "I don't know. I didn't see anything. But you won't find answers from the crew. Not the ones who matter. It's all handled by people above our pay grade, and Klein is the one keeping it all together. She's the one you need to be worried about." I sat back, absorbing everything he had just told me. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they didn't fit neatly. They were jagged, and they didn't want to make sense. Klein was at the center of everything, manipulating the crew and the investors to run some kind of scam, while Dunsmore had no clue just how deep the rot had gotten. And Keely? He had been the one to see it all, and someone had silenced him for good. I slid out of the booth, my mind racing. "You've been helpful, Harry," I said, my voice cold. "But I don't think this conversation's over." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "You keep poking around, and you're going to end up like Keely, Goodwin. Don't say I didn't warn you." I didn't need to hear more. I tossed a few bills on the table and made my way out of the bar, my mind already working through the next steps. I had to get back to the brownstone, back to Wolfe. He needed to know what I had learned, and he needed to know fast. There was more to this than a simple murder. There was a conspiracy that could ruin everything, and if I didn't act quickly, the only thing I'd be left investigating would be my own obituary. I made my way back through the narrow streets, the weight of the case pressing down on me. When I arrived at the brownstone, I found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, sitting in his chair, his attention absorbed in a book. He looked up as I entered, his face betraying nothing. "Did you learn what you needed to know, Archie?" he asked, his voice as composed as ever. I could tell that he already had a good idea of where this was going, but I filled him in on everything I'd uncovered. The crew, the investors, the layers of deception and greed. When I finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far beyond the room. "So you think Klein is behind it all?" he asked finally, his voice calm but carrying a weight of finality. "I don't think she's the only one," I replied, "but she's certainly the one pulling the strings." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Then it seems we've reached the part of the investigation where subtlety will no longer suffice. We shall proceed accordingly, Archie. But first, we wait." I raised an eyebrow. "Wait for what?" "For her to make her next move, of course." Wolfe's calm assessment of the situation was, as always, disorienting. He could sit there, in the cool silence of his office, letting the pieces of a puzzle fall into place without so much as a ripple in his posture. But I wasn't as patient as he was. The wheels of the investigation were turning faster than I could keep up, and every time I thought I had a solid lead, it slipped away like sand through my fingers. That night, as I sat at my desk in the brownstone, the tension in the air was palpable. I hadn't expected Klein to make her move so soon, but I should have known better. People like her didn't wait. They were always one step ahead. I hadn't expected her to be bold enough to show her hand, but I underestimated how much she wanted to keep control. Around midnight, the phone rang. I knew it wasn't Wolfe's usual late-night callers. It wasn't his style to take calls at this hour unless something was wrong. I picked up the receiver, my voice low. Goodwin, I said, trying to sound as composed as possible. Mr. Goodwin, came the voice on the other end. It was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. Harry, I said, recognizing the tone of the wiry deckhand immediately. His voice was tinged with panic. I've made a mistake, Harry said, his words tumbling out in a rush. I told you things I shouldn't have, Goodwin. Klein's on to me. I straightened up in my chair. What do you mean, on to you? I should have kept quiet, he muttered, the sound of his voice shaking. She knows I talked. She sent someone to warn me off. I'm not safe, Goodwin. You have to get out here. She's watching. Where are you? I asked, my pulse quickening. He hesitated before answering. I'm at the shipyard. The Queen's still docked, but I don't trust it anymore. She's moving things around, shifting people. It's not just about Keeley. They're planning something bigger, Goodwin. Something you'll regret getting involved with. I felt my gut twist. Stay there, Harry. Don't move. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't let anyone see you. I hung up without waiting for a reply. Wolfe was already heading to bed by the time I grabbed my coat, but I didn't have time to explain. I wasn't going to drag him into this yet. Not until I had a clearer picture of what Klein was planning. The streets were quieter than usual as I made my way toward the docks. The wind whipped through the narrow alleys, making the air feel even colder than it already was. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I took care to avoid the more populated streets. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Klein's reach was far, and if she had people looking for anyone digging too deep, they would know exactly where to find me. By the time I reached the shipyard, the Corinthian Queen loomed ahead, a massive silhouette in the dim glow of the harbor lights. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet for a place like this, especially so late at night. I spotted Harry, crouched behind a stack of crates near the ship, looking every bit as nervous as he sounded on the phone. Harry, I whispered, walking toward him. He jumped at the sound of my voice. You shouldn't be here, he hissed, glancing over his shoulder. She's got eyes everywhere. I scanned the area quickly, but there was no one in sight. What's going on, Harry? I asked again, this time more urgently. What exactly is Klein planning? He shook his head, his eyes wide. You don't get it. She's been moving money, handling things in secret. I thought it was just the crew, just the investors, but it's bigger than that. The ship, it's part of some kind of laundering operation, but it's more than just money. It's about control. Klein's been setting up a network, pulling in the people with the right connections, and Keeley was trying to stop her. He was trying to go to the authorities that stopped me cold. You're saying Klein killed Keeley because he was going to expose her? Harry nodded, his face grim. Keeley wasn't going to just disappear. He had a plan. He knew too much. I stared at him, trying to make sense of the tangle of facts and suspicions. And what does this have to do with the investors? What are they involved in? The investors. They're all just a front, Goodwin, Harry muttered, his voice shaking. They're buying into this luxury ship like it's just another high-class getaway, but it's not. The real deal is happening behind the scenes. There's an entire operation running through this ship, from money laundering to something darker. I don't know all the details, but Keeley was too close to the center of it. Too much leverage. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. This wasn't just a petty crime or a squabble among the crew. It was a network, one that stretched far beyond the ship itself, and it was dangerous. People were willing to kill to keep it all hidden. I didn't have time to process it all. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Stay low, I told Harry, my voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. I'm going to confront Klein. She's making a mistake if she thinks she can run things without anyone noticing. Harry grabbed my arm as I turned to leave. You're playing with fire, Goodwin, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She'll burn you down before you even see it coming. I didn't respond. There was no point in talking him down. Harry already knew what was at stake. I was going to take this one step further, and Klein was going to regret ever thinking she could hide her operation behind the mask of a luxury yacht. If she thought she could control the ship, the crew and the investors, she hadn't yet met the real force she was up against. I made my way back toward the dock, my mind racing, preparing for whatever move Klein would make next. The game was about to change, and I intended to be the one calling the shots. I left Harry crouched behind the crates, my mind swirling with everything he had just revealed. The pieces of this puzzle were beginning to fall into place, each revelation adding weight to the investigation. It wasn't just a case of murder or sabotage anymore. The stakes were much higher. Klein was orchestrating something far more dangerous, something tied to a network that stretched beyond the ship. Money laundering, hidden connections, dark dealings. Keely had been caught in the middle, trying to expose it all. I made my way toward the ship, keeping to the shadows as I approached the Corinthian Queen. The ship loomed like a dark monument, silent and watchful, almost as if it could sense the tension in the air. The lights from the dock reflected off the water, casting eerie, shimmering ripples across the hull. The quiet of the night was oppressive, but there was a sense of urgency now, a need to act before Klein made her next move. I slipped aboard without much difficulty. After all, a ship this size wasn't built for stealth, and the crew's focus had clearly shifted elsewhere. Klein had a plan, and it wasn't one that would go unnoticed for long. My heart was racing, but I kept my steps slow and deliberate. The last thing I wanted was to make noise and alert someone to my presence. I made my way toward the bridge, the heart of the ship. The captain's quarters were nearby, and I had a strong hunch that if anything was going to happen tonight, it would be here. As I passed through the narrow halls, I saw shadows moving behind the curtains in the crew's quarters, but I didn't stop. I was on a different mission now, one that involved confronting the mastermind herself. By the time I reached the bridge, the door was ajar. I could hear muffled voices inside, but I couldn't make out the words. Slowly, I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the door, trying to catch something, anything that would give me an edge. It was Klein's voice, but there was another voice too. Deeper, older, more authoritative. Couldn't place it immediately, but it sounded familiar. "You're sure he's out of the picture?" Klein's voice was sharp, controlled, but underneath it I could hear the tension. "He's gone," the second voice replied, calm and almost soothing, but there was an edge of finality to it. "Keely won't be a problem anymore. We've taken care of it. You're in the clear." There was a pause, and I pressed my ear harder against the door, heart pounding. "Good," Klein said, her voice colder now. "But this can't be traced back to us. You understand? If anything leaks, I know the risks," the other voice interrupted, and then I heard a faint rustle as though papers were being shuffled. "We've covered our tracks. Everything's in place. We'll make sure the investors stay in the dark. As for the crew, they'll fall in line soon enough." I felt a rush of anger flare up in me, but I forced it down. This wasn't about my feelings. It was about stopping whatever it was Klein had set in motion. If she had truly orchestrated Keely's death, and she was involved in laundering money or running some criminal operation under the guise of a luxury yacht, this had gone far beyond a simple case. This was a much deeper, far more dangerous conspiracy, and Klein was at the center of it. I waited a few more moments, hoping for a slip, a mistake. But it seemed like the conversation was wrapping up. I needed to act. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, my mind already calculating my next move. It was clear that Klein had no intention of letting anyone, investor, crew, or anyone else, stand in her way, and I was about to make sure she wouldn't have the chance to bury this any further. The door creaked open slightly, and I caught a glimpse of her standing at the far side of the room, talking to a man I hadn't seen before. He was older, with graying hair and sharp features. Someone who looked as if he'd spent his life in dark corners, dealing with people like Klein. His eyes flicked toward the door, just as I stepped into the room. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Klein's eyes widened, and the man beside her tensed, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket. I didn't give them a chance to react. "You're not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady but cold, stepping fully into the room. Klein's expression was a mixture of surprise and annoyance, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice smooth, but there was an edge to it now. "I wasn't expecting you here. You've been quite the nuisance, haven't you?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what you're up to, Klein. I know about Keeley, and I know that if I don't stop you now, you're going to bury a lot more than just him." The man beside her, someone who had to be more than just an accomplice, stepped forward, his hand still resting on his pocket. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice calm but with an undeniable threat behind it. "You should leave now, Mr. Goodwin, before things get messy." I held my ground, not even flinching. "You're not in charge here." "Klein is, and right now she's out of options. The ship's going down, and it's going down with her." Klein's eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, anger, maybe both. But she masked it quickly with a carefully practiced calm. "You think you can stop this? You have no idea what's really going on here. You've barely scratched the surface." "Then let me scratch deeper," I shot back, my gaze unwavering. She turned to the man beside her, and for a brief moment, I saw something pass between them, some unspoken decision, a silent understanding that perhaps it was too late to silence me. Klein stepped back, her voice suddenly icy. "You won't get out of here alive, Goodwin. You've meddled enough." But I wasn't about to back down. Not now, not when I was this close. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I knew exactly who it was before I even turned around. It was Wolfe. I turned, my hand instinctively reaching for my coat as I saw Wolfe's towering figure filling the doorway. He stood there, as calm as ever, the usual faint scowl on his face, though his eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed squarely on Klein and her companion. "You seem to have miscalculated, Miss Klein," Wolfe said, his voice rich with the weight of certainty, like a man who had already arrived at the conclusion and was simply letting the others catch up. "I trust you've been running your operation smoothly, but it appears you've neglected a rather important detail." Klein's expression shifted, her jaw tightening, but she didn't immediately respond. Instead, she glanced at the man standing next to her, a burly figure whose hand still hovered near the inside of his jacket. I could almost see her mind racing, trying to figure out how to extricate herself from this situation without losing the upper hand. But Wolfe was never one to lose control. And in this particular room, it was clear that the game had just changed. "Mr. Wolfe," Klein said, a forced sweetness in her tone, but her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "I wasn't expecting a visit from you. I thought you preferred to remain in the shadows." Wolfe didn't flinch, his voice unruffled. "I make it a point to avoid unnecessary exertion, but there are moments when it is simply more convenient to make an appearance. This, Miss Klein, is one of those moments." The man beside her shifted his weight, but Wolfe's presence was enough to keep him from making any hasty moves. For a moment, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Wolfe, as always, was in complete control. He'd come to a conclusion, and it was clear from the glint in his eyes that he wasn't about to let anyone derail it. "Your little operation," Wolfe continued, his gaze moving from Klein to the man beside her, "is in far greater jeopardy than you realize. I'm sure you've anticipated that someone would eventually catch wind of it, but what you haven't accounted for is that the person doing so would be me." Klein's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You think you can stop me, Wolfe?" she asked, her voice thick with both disdain and the slightest trace of desperation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." People like you don't understand how deep this goes. You can't just shut it down with a few clever words. Wolfe's expression never wavered. I'm not concerned with your grandiose ideas, Miss Klein. I'm concerned with results, and the result of your actions is clear. You've managed to poison an entire crew, and now you're about to drag several innocent people into a situation they never bargained for. That is what I'm here to correct. The man beside Klein stepped forward, his posture more aggressive now. Enough, he growled, finally revealing the threat in his voice. You've made a mistake, Wolfe. This doesn't concern you. Wolfe didn't flinch. You're correct. It doesn't concern me. It concerns the law, and it concerns your involvement in a series of illegal activities that you clearly think you can keep hidden under the guise of a luxury yacht. Klein's companion looked like he was about to make a move, but before he could act, Wolfe spoke again, his tone low and controlled. I've already called the authorities. They'll be here shortly. I suggest you make a choice. Remain here and face them, or leave the way you came in. There was a brief silence as Klein processed this information. For the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected Wolfe's arrival, nor had she anticipated the kind of resolve that had accompanied him. She wasn't the only one who could play a long game. Wolfe had been setting this up. He'd known that Klein would make a mistake, that her ego would push her too far, and now she was caught. The tension in the room seemed to stretch out indefinitely. Klein's companion, the man who had been so quick to threaten, seemed to realize they were outmatched. His hand slowly withdrew from his jacket, and he took a step back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Klein's lips tightened, but there was nothing more she could do. You've underestimated me, Miss Klein, Wolfe said, his voice a final declaration. And you've underestimated the consequences of your actions. You've been playing a game with the wrong people. You thought you could hide your little empire behind a ship, but all it took was a few careful observations, a couple of well-placed questions, and your entire operation unraveled. Klein's eyes flashed with a mix of fury and frustration, but she remained silent. She could no longer argue her way out of this. She had run out of moves. I suggest you don't waste any more time, Wolfe continued. You'll find your way to the authorities soon enough. But if you think you can escape what's coming, you're mistaken. For a moment, there was a silence, a tense, unspoken acknowledgement that this game was over. Klein stood there, her gaze fixed on Wolfe, calculating her next move. But whatever plans she had left were about to be dashed. And then, just as I was about to step forward, I heard the distant sound of sirens growing louder, a sure sign that Wolfe's call had been effective. The authorities were on their way, and they would be the ones to handle the fallout. Klein and her companion exchanged one last look, the weight of their defeat sinking in. Wolfe turned to me, his gaze steady as always. Well, Archie, I think we've done enough for tonight. I nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction settling over me. Seems like it, boss. As the sirens drew closer, Klein's defiance faded. She knew, as we all did, that the game was up, and as the lights from the approaching patrol cars illuminated the dock, it felt as though the last of the shadows were finally being chased away. Wolfe had done what he did best. He'd unraveled the truth, exposed the lies, and made sure justice would be served. But as usual, I had the feeling we'd barely scratched the surface. As the first patrol car rolled into view, its flashing lights cutting through the fog like a beacon, the atmosphere around the Corinthian Queen seemed to shift. The tension that had filled the air moments earlier dissolved into the cold indifference of the impending conclusion. Klein stood motionless, her lips pressed together in a thin line, while her companion, now clearly defeated, sagged slightly as if the weight of the situation had finally sunk in. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me, his gaze sharp, calculating, as though he were mentally checking off the last details. I had the distinct sense that, even now, he was still several steps ahead. Klein and her associate were caught, but Wolfe had orchestrated this entire confrontation, from his subtle positioning of evidence to his well-timed phone call to the authorities. And, as always, I was just there to witness the unraveling. I had no intention of speaking unless necessary, but I could feel Klein's eyes on me, her expression a mixture of resentment and cold calculation. She wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not yet. She might not have had the power to turn things around now, but that didn't mean she wasn't going to try. "You think you've won, Wolfe?" she asked, her voice low but filled with venom. "You think you've stopped this? The ship, the operation, it's bigger than you. You don't know what you've just dismantled." Wolfe didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, his face betraying no emotion, his silence louder than any words could have been. But I knew better than to think he was ignoring her. He was waiting for her to expose herself further, waiting for the last few threads of her plan to unravel. When the sirens finally reached a crescendo and the officers stepped onto the dock, Wolfe gave a slight nod toward them, signaling the end of Klein's brief reign over the Corinthian queen. The officers were quick, efficient, and, thankfully, familiar with Wolfe's methods. They moved to arrest Klein and her companion, but before they could put handcuffs on either of them, Klein spoke again. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You can arrest me, you can throw me in jail, but there are others. You'll never find all of them. I'll be out before you even realize what's happening. You think you've won? You've just started the clock." The officers paused, uncertain for a brief moment. But Wolfe, as always, wasn't bothered by threats or bluffs. His response was simple. "Perhaps. But it's a game you've already lost, Miss Klein." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't speak again. The officers went about their work, securing the two suspects and leading them toward the patrol car. As the last of the police vehicles pulled away from the dock, I turned to Wolfe. "You think she's right?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Wolfe glanced at me, his face impassive as always, but there was a gleam in his eyes, a glimmer of satisfaction. "She's lying, Archie," he said simply. "People like her always try to hold on to a thread of hope, even when they know the end is near. What she doesn't understand is that the pieces of her operation have already been scattered far enough that they'll never be reassembled. She overplayed her hand. But she did manage to get away with this for a long time," I said, still processing the full scope of what had been revealed. Money laundering, illegal deals, and keeping it all under the radar for so long. She couldn't have done that alone. Wolfe gave a small nod, his mind already piecing together the remaining fragments. She was the centerpiece, certainly. But there were others in the background. Investors, crew members, possibly even people outside the shipyard. You're right to be cautious, Archie. But the key to dismantling this particular network was simply showing Klein that the walls were closing in. I thought about everything we had uncovered. The strange tension between the crew, the secret dealings, and Klein's cold demeanor throughout. And the first mate, Keeley. He wasn't just some loose end. He was about to expose everything, wasn't he? Wolfe's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, though it wasn't one of satisfaction. Keeley was both a threat and a liability. He knew too much, but more importantly, he was willing to act on that knowledge. That made him dangerous, not only to Klein, but to everyone involved. Once he became a liability, she had no choice but to eliminate him. I nodded, the weight of it all sinking in. It had been about more than just keeping the ship afloat. It had been about control, keeping the operation running smoothly, hidden from the eyes of the authorities. But that was all over now, thanks to Wolfe's careful manipulation. As we made our way back to the brownstone, the city was quiet. Too quiet, almost, as if it were holding its breath. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting the streetlights in sharp streaks. Wolfe's silence was expected, but I could sense that there was something more he was thinking about, something still unresolved. When we reached the front steps of the brownstone, Wolfe stopped and turned to me, his gaze as sharp as ever. "There's one thing I must address before we retire for the evening, Archie," he said, his voice calm but edged with an unmistakable intensity. "Klein was right about one thing. There are always others. I would be a fool to think that this is over, even now. We may have caught the ringmaster, but there are pieces still in play." I looked at him, waiting for the next move. "So what now?" I asked, sensing that the final chapter of this case hadn't quite been written. Wolfe's lips twitched slightly. "Now we wait. The pieces are scattered, and sooner or later someone will try to pick them up again, but next time we'll be ready." And with that, he turned and made his way inside, leaving me standing on the steps, the weight of the case lingering in the night air. The game wasn't over. Not yet. But I knew, as always, that Wolfe would be waiting. The next few days passed in a strange silence, one that was both unsettling and familiar. We'd won, at least on the surface. Klein and her associate were in custody. The authorities had taken control of the Corinthian Queen, and the web of corruption that had once held the ship and many of its passengers was now in the hands of law enforcement. But there was something about the aftermath that felt unfinished, like a puzzle missing just one crucial piece. Wolfe spent most of the time in his usual spot, in the chair that seemed to have become a part of him, flipping through papers or reading a book with an air of detachment. But I knew better than to think he wasn't still thinking, calculating. There was always something more with Wolfe, some deeper angle, some hidden thread. If Klein's operation had been as large as it seemed, it wasn't just a matter of arresting her. There were others involved, people who had yet to be uncovered, and Wolfe knew it. I, on the other hand, had been out on the streets, checking in with a few old contacts, seeing if anything had surfaced. A few of the crew members had been rounded up and questioned, but there were no immediate breakthroughs. The investors who'd been tricked into believing they were part of a legitimate venture were mostly in the dark, leaving the real masterminds behind the scenes untouched. It was clear the investigation was far from over. One afternoon, I returned to the brownstone, hoping for something, a clue, a lead, anything that would give me a sense of where the case was headed. Wolfe didn't look up from his book when I walked in, but I knew he'd already heard me. His mind never stopped working, and if there was one thing I'd learned in all my years working for him, it was that he always knew more than he let on. "Anything?" I asked, my voice casual, but the tension of the last few days weighing on me. Wolfe didn't look up immediately, but his fingers paused on the page, and I could tell his mind was elsewhere. "There is something, Archie. It has taken me a few days to see it clearly, but the truth is, Klein was never the heart of this operation. She was a player, yes, but not the key piece." I felt a jolt of curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I thought she was pulling the strings. She had everything under control." Wolfe finally looked up, his eyes glinting with that familiar sharpness. "She was useful to the operation, no doubt, but she was disposable. The true mastermind, the person who stands behind all of this, is still out there. Klein was just the one who was in front when we came calling." I leaned against the door frame, trying to process what he was saying. "So you're saying Klein wasn't the top of the pyramid?" "Precisely," Wolfe said, setting the book aside. "She was a conduit, not the architect. There is someone else, someone with far more influence, far more power, and far better at covering their tracks. Klein's arrest was a necessary step, but it has not solved the puzzle." I frowned. "Then who are we talking about?" "Who else is involved?" Wolfe's gaze hardened. "I don't know yet. But we will find out." That was all he said. The rest of the conversation drifted into silence as he returned to his book, his mind clearly already in motion. But I didn't need him to say more. I knew that when Wolfe said, "We will find out," it was as much a promise as a declaration of intent. The case wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Over the next few days, we began digging deeper, sifting through the details that Klein had left behind. Wolfe instructed me to review every document, every file related to the ship's operations. We revisited the crew members who hadn't been questioned thoroughly, those whose loyalty to Klein had been more suspect than we'd realized. But nothing tangible came up. There was a distinct absence of the key players Wolfe had suspected. The trail had gone cold, and even I was starting to wonder if we were chasing shadows. Then, just as I was about to call it another dead end, I got a call from an old contact of mine at the docks. He didn't say much over the phone, just that he had something I needed to see. No explanation, just the urgency in his voice. I'd learned long ago that when a contact spoke like that, it meant something important was coming. I met him at a small bar near the waterfront, the kind of place where deals were made with a handshake and a bottle of cheap whiskey. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of smoke and beer. But my contact was already there, sitting at a corner booth, his face tense. "Goodwin," he said, barely glancing up as I approached. "I've got something for you. Something that'll get you closer." He slid a folder across the table, and I wasted no time tearing it open. Inside was a series of photographs. Shots of Klein, of the Corinthian Queen, of meetings between Klein and several individuals I didn't recognize. The photographs were taken discreetly, but there was one that caught my eye. A picture of Klein shaking hands with someone on the deck of the Queen, someone whose face was partially obscured but whose posture suggested authority. "Who is this?" I asked, pointing to the photo. My contact leaned in, his voice low. "That's the man you need to find. His name's Lucas. I don't know much more than that, but I've seen him around the ship a few times. He's the one calling the shots, not Klein." That was the lead I needed. Wolfe's instincts had been right all along. We weren't dealing with just a corrupt officer and a few crooked crew members. There was someone much deeper in the shadows, and now, finally, I had a name. Lucas. It was time to find him. I spent the next few hours thinking about the man in the photograph. Lucas. The name was unfamiliar, and the half-obscured face didn't help much, but the connection to Klein was undeniable. If he was the real mastermind, the one calling the shots, then he was the key to unraveling the rest of the operation. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was sitting in his chair, his eyes fixed on a book, though I could tell by the way his fingers tapped idly on the armrest that his mind wasn't on the pages in front of him. He'd been waiting for me to return, expecting news, and I didn't disappoint him. I dropped the folder on the desk in front of him, pointing to the photo of Lucas. Wolfe glanced at it briefly before flipping through the rest of the file with deliberate slowness. He didn't seem surprised by the contents, but then, when did he ever? "Lucas," I said, watching him. "This is the man. The real operator behind everything. Klein was just the visible piece. This is the guy we need to find." Wolfe's eyes flicked back to the photograph, then to me. "I've been expecting something like this," he said softly. "There is always someone in the background, pulling the strings." Klein was too confident, too sure of herself. She wasn't the one who built this network. She was the one who maintained it. Lucas is the architect. "So where do we find him?" I asked, leaning forward. "He's not exactly standing on the corner with a sign saying arrest me." Wolfe didn't respond right away. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the photograph again, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. "Lucas is a shadow," he said finally. "The kind of person who makes sure no one ever notices his role. He doesn't want to be found. He's careful." I took a seat, glancing over the contents of the folder once more, looking for something I might have missed. "So, we're supposed to just wait for him to show up?" I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "If he's hiding, how are we supposed to find him?" "Patience, Archie," Wolfe said with a hint of a smile. "We will not wait for him to appear." We will find a way to bring him to us. The next few days were a blur of activity. Wolfe, as always, remained a step ahead, setting his pieces into place with his characteristic calm and precision. I, on the other hand, found myself running all over the city, tracking down every lead I could find on Lucas. It wasn't easy. There were no obvious connections, no addresses linked to his name, and no one who could definitively say where he'd gone or what he was up to. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth, but Wolfe never stopped searching. One morning, he called me into his office with a note of triumph in his voice. "I believe we've found our opening, Archie," he said, holding up a slip of paper. It was an address, and as he handed it to me, I saw the confidence in his eyes. I took the note, studying it carefully. "What's this?" "It's where Lucas is hiding," Wolfe said, his tone steady. "I've arranged for a little bait to draw him out." The address was an abandoned building on the edge of town, a crumbling structure that looked like it hadn't seen life in years. The kind of place you'd expect to find a fugitive trying to disappear. I was about to ask Wolfe how he'd come by this information, but he waved me off as though it wasn't important. "You'll need to be discreet, Archie," he said, his voice becoming more businesslike. "We don't want to alert him too soon. I want to know everything, who he's meeting, who he's working with, how deep this goes. If we're lucky, he'll lead us right to the heart of the operation." I nodded, already gathering my things. "And if we're not lucky?" Wolfe's lips quirked slightly. "Then we'll make our own luck." It was dark by the time I arrived at the building. The streets were empty, and the wind had kicked up, adding a chill to the air. I parked a few blocks away, keeping my distance to avoid being spotted. The last thing I needed was for Lucas to sense something was off before we had a chance to catch him in the act. The building was exactly as I had imagined. Run down, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling from the walls. But there was movement inside. Shadows flickered in the dim light that managed to spill through the cracks, and I could hear muffled voices, low and urgent. I moved closer, careful not to make a sound. There was no going back now. If this was it, if Lucas was really inside, I needed to be ready for anything. As I crept closer to one of the open windows, I paused, listening. The voices grew louder, clearer. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the tone. It was a conversation, a negotiation of sorts. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang, then the distinct sound of footsteps approaching the door. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't have much time. I backed away from the window, trying to find a better vantage point. I couldn't let him slip away. Not when we were so close. I just hoped Wolfe's plan was as foolproof as he'd promised, because if not, I might be facing Lucas alone. I crouched low behind a stack of old crates, my breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer to the door, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I was about to meet Lucas, the elusive mastermind who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The building creaked with the weight of anticipation. There was no turning back now. The door to the abandoned structure groaned as it opened, and I tensed, preparing for whatever came next. But instead of a confrontation, there was a brief pause, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. I dared a glance around the corner, just enough to catch a glimpse of a figure entering the dimly lit room. It wasn't Lucas. It was a man I hadn't expected to see, Captain Dunsmore. The old captain, once a towering presence aboard the Corinthian Queen, now looked small and frail, his posture slumped with age and wear. But there was something in his eyes, something calculating, hidden behind the haze of his years. I almost couldn't believe it. I stayed hidden, watching carefully. Lucas wasn't far behind. He entered the room with a silent confidence, his dark coat sweeping behind him. I'd been expecting someone much more refined, someone more accustomed to playing the shadows. But this man, this Lucas, was different. He exuded power, even in the dim light. The two men exchanged a few words I couldn't catch, but I didn't need to hear them to know what was happening. This wasn't a meeting of equals. Dunsmore had been nothing more than a puppet, a decoy, a figurehead, while Lucas had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. Lucas looked at Dunsmore with a cold amusement, his lips curling into a small, dismissive smile. "You're a liability now, Captain." But I think you understand that Dunsmore's eyes flickered nervously. But he didn't respond. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was something deeper, something he had carried all these years under the guise of respect for the Corinthian queen. He'd known, somewhere deep inside, that his role had always been a distraction. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Lucas added, his voice smooth. "You've done your part. You'll be taken care of." I took a step forward, just as the door to the room swung closed behind Lucas. My mind raced. Everything Wolfe had suspected, every thread he'd pulled, had led to this moment. Dunsmore had been involved from the beginning, but it wasn't his incompetence that had caused the mess. He had been part of the plan. The crew, the investors, the manipulation, it had all been calculated, all part of Lucas's grand design. I had no choice but to act. I made my way to the back door, pushing it open carefully. My gun was tucked in my jacket, but I wasn't ready to draw it just yet. I needed to hear more, understand what Lucas planned next. If Dunsmore had been involved willingly, then there was a chance he knew how to bring this all to an end. As I entered the room, I caught sight of Dunsmore again. He was standing by a rickety table, his hands resting on the edge as he stared down at the paperwork before him. There was no point in pretending anymore. This had gone far beyond a simple case of corruption. It was about control, and Lucas was about to lose it all. "Captain," I said, my voice breaking the silence. Dunsmore's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and recognition. He knew who I was. He knew what I'd uncovered. But there was no point in running anymore. "Goodwin," he rasped, his voice hoarse. I never wanted any of this. But Lucas, he promised me a future, a way to be someone again. I was weak. Your weakness killed a man," I said, my voice steady. "Keely's dead, Dunsmore, and now it's your turn to face the consequences." He flinched at the mention of Keely's name, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his guilt had finally hit him. "I never meant for him to get hurt," Dunsmore muttered, his hands shaking. "But when you're in too deep, there's no way out. Not unless you play along. Lucas, he has a way of making people believe they have no choice." I felt my gut tighten as I considered Dunsmore's words. This wasn't just a matter of greed, it was about control, about Lucas's manipulation of every single person he came into contact with. He was a puppet master, and everyone else was a mere pawn. "Where is he now?" I asked, my voice low. "Steady." Dunsmore hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting toward the door as if considering escape. But he didn't run. He knew it was over. "He's gone," Dunsmore said finally, his voice strained. "He knew you'd come looking for him. He's disappeared." My heart sank. We were too late. Lucas had slipped away, once again vanishing into the shadows before we could catch him. But that wasn't the end of it. If Lucas was still out there, I knew we hadn't seen the last of him. He was too dangerous to be left unchecked. "I'll find him," I said, my voice cold with resolve. Dunsmore nodded slowly, his eyes haunted. "You're not the only one who's looking." I turned to leave, my mind racing. Wolfe had known this wouldn't be over quickly, but I hadn't realized just how far Lucas's reach extended. He was still out there, still pulling strings, and it was only a matter of time before his operation surfaced again. The game wasn't over, but for now, it was clear. Lucas had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. And I would find him, no matter where he tried to hide. 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 He tried to